The full biological explanation of the human condition is presented in Chapter 3 of Freedom, but it will be useful to summarise it here in this video. So, before we developed conscious intelligence, our behaviour was governed by naturally selected instincts, just like all other animals are today. Our instinctive orientation to the world was actually to behave unconditionally, selflessly towards others. And we recognise this today as our moral conscience. When our conscious thinking mind emerged, it challenged our pre-existing moral instincts for the role of managing our lives. And unlike naturally selected instincts, a conscious mind is insightful and requires understanding to operate effectively. This means it was not enough for it to be simply guided by instincts. It had to understand why those instincts were correct. However, in the beginning, we had no understanding. So inevitably, we had to search for understanding. But many of the conscious decisions that we made along the way contradicted our instincts, which meant we essentially had to live with an influx of criticism from our instincts while we searched for knowledge. Ultimately, the self-knowledge that's been presented in Jeremy Griffith's book Freedom, which would alleviate that criticism. In other words, we had to learn from our mistakes and feel guilty in the process. Therefore, becoming conscious inevitably resulted in a psychologically upsetting clash between our instincts and our conscious intellect. This upsetting clash could only end by finding the understanding of the difference in the way genes and nerves process information. That one can orient a species, but the other, the nerve-based learning system, is insightful and requires understanding to manage life. Until we had this understanding, we had no other option than to defy the criticism from our instincts artificially by defensively retaliating against it, becoming preoccupied with seeking positive reinforcement to counter the negative implications of it, so to prove that we were good and not bad, and by blocking it out of our minds. So we became angry, egocentric and alienated, which is the way we've had to live under the duress of the human condition. So we're angry, egocentric and alienated, but now that we have understanding of the human condition, the understanding that we've always needed, we no longer have to live in this angry, egocentric and alienated way. So in other words, we no longer have to feel criticised and therefore insecure about our worth, because this instinct versus intellect explanation of the human condition establishes our worth at the most fundamental level. So ultimately, the information in Jeremy Griffith's book Freedom has the power to bring about a whole new world for humanity, one in which everyone is happy, loving, caring and cooperative, because they're no longer insecure about their goodness and worthiness. The human race has been immensely heroic to have lived under the duress of the human condition for 2 million years, and the necessary denials that we've adopted to cope with this oppressed existence mean that what I'm currently saying will likely be both very hard to believe and even offensive to hear. There have been many false starts to a world free of the human condition, in which we return to a loving, ideal world. But these never worked, and so the cold, selfish world of reality always retained its grip on humanity. The reason for this is because none of those false starts were based on the fully accountable, first principle, biological understanding of the human condition, and nothing less than this understanding would justify such a transformation. However, this information is not a dogmatic false start to a new world for humans, but the real, rational, biological, understanding-based liberation of our species. It might sound too good to be true, but it is true. So I sincerely hope that you take the time to investigate this information for yourself and persevere with it until you've accessed the truth of it for yourself. And by doing so, we'll have verified all the claims that I've made about it here in this video. If you do that, your life will also be transformed, and a whole new world of happiness, meaning and purpose will open up.